Hello, John Bloodworth, Gentleman Crafter, back with part 12 in my Fun with Foundation paper piecing series. This time I'm going to show you how to make the crocus. And don't forget, you can download the pattern that I'm showing you along with the cutting guide from my blog, gentlemancrafter.com. Now it requires 3 colours of fabric or 3 different patterns. And the cutting guide will give you an idea of how to cut the fabric. And I've basically already done that and sorted them into numerical order. I'm going to start by positioning part 1 right side facing up within the dotted square, not the dashed square, the dotted square. Part 2 is then going to go on top with right side facing down, and then I'm going to pin that in position. Working with small pieces here, so 1 pin should suffice. Next, I'm going to stitch along the line that separates parts 1 and 2, and that's the dashed line. It's a very short line, so it won't take long to sew. But as ever, we're using a very short stitch length, and we're doing a lock stitch or reverse stitch at the start and end of the line to secure everything in place. Trimming the threads at both ends, and then I'll be folding back part 2 and pressing that in place using a finger presser. If you prefer to press with a mini iron as you go and a pressing sheet, feel free. That will help give you crisper seams as you work, but of course you can press the whole block at the end if you prefer. Now for part 3, it's the rectangle that will sit on top of parts 1 and 2. So if you followed the cutting guide, that should fit pretty much exactly on top. And you'll line it up with the raw edges of parts 1 and 2. Then pin it in place. Don't necessarily have to pin as you work. I just find it helps things stop moving around. And it doesn't have to go through all layers, as long as it's secured to something underneath, that's fine. Stitching along the line that separates part 3 from parts 1 and 2. And just a reminder, you're stitching on that dashed line, not either side of it. This is very important when we're working at this scale and with such small pieces, as it's going to mean nice, accurate positioning of your stitching and of course of the pieces. Next up, folding back part 3 and pressing that stitching. Now for part 4, it is a triangle on the pattern, but I'm actually working with rectangles and I'm going to trim as I go. So you're lining that up with the corner of part 1. And the raw edges of parts 1 and 3. It might look like a large rectangle for the piece that we're covering, but as I go through this video further, you'll see why this is important. So we're stitching all along the line that separates part 4 from parts 3 and 1. And remember, you're only stitching the length of that line. You're not going any further before or after. Don't forget to trim as you go. Folding back that part. Excuse me. Now, part 5 is the other part of that section. So, before we continue sewing, we're going to position a piece of card along the line that separates parts 4 and 5, fold back the pattern, and use our add a quarter ruler, or of course just a general ruler at 1/4 inch, and then trim away all of the excess. That also gives us a nice straight line against which to position the next piece, which is piece number 5. Again, right sides down, and just positioning it so that it will cover all of that section. So in this case, it will be about the middle of that line that you've just cut. Take your time to make sure everything lines up and gets into place correctly, as it will save you a lot of bother later on. Just a reminder, as I stitch this in place, I do have a Facebook group where people are sharing what they're making as they follow along with this series of videos. So if you'd like to take part, please feel free to come along to Facebook and hunt down my foundation paper piecing group. Alternatively, the easy way is just to find the link in the description below the video on YouTube, or the link on the accompanying blog post on my website, gentlemancrafter.com. Okay, so I stitched along the line between parts 4 and 5. Trimming the thread. Taking out the pins and then folding that part back. And that should entirely cover part 5. And you can already see that crocus design forming. Now we're going to do the same now for parts 6 and 7. So part 6 should go along that raw edge and give you at least 1/4 inch either side of that block that's made up of parts 6 and 7. If you followed the cutting guide, you should have absolutely no problem. Okay, we're going to stitch along the line that separates part 6 from everything else that's already stitched. And if you're wondering why I'm using such a very short stitch length, it's basically because it will perforate the paper as you sew and therefore make it easier to tear away when you've finished sewing your blocks together. Tearing away in reverse order also helps. Probably towards the end of the year, I'll do a video about joining blocks and tearing out the pieces and all that sort of stuff. So if you are following along, you'll have that later in the year. Okay, so there's part 6 in place. Now, as we did before I stitch part 7 in place, I am going to use the add a quarter ruler to trim away the excess between parts 6 and 7. In we go with part 7. And that's fitting along the flat edge that you've just trimmed. As you can see, for foundation paper piecing, there's not a lot that you need. So it's a nice easy one to get into if you want to enjoy sewing as a hobby, but don't necessarily want to get all sorts of different rulers and gadgets and stuff. And because we're using a straight stitch with a short stitch length, pretty much any budget you've got for a sewing machine will give you what you need. Okay, so that's part 7 stitched in place. I'm just going to fold that back. And as you can see, that nicely covers part 7. And we've now got all the points of the crocus in place. Now what I'm going to do is go around and trim away all of the excess from all of the corner sections. So rather than doing it one by one, because these are going to be sewn in sequence, I can just trim away everything before I start. The 4 corner pieces are all the same size, so I'm going to show you how to stitch one in place, and then I will skip to the end to save a little bit of time. But basically once you've done one, you know exactly what you're doing for the other 3. Okay, so working in sequence, starting with 8 corner piece. Take one of our triangles and position it right side facing down, exactly in the center, or as close to as you can get it. I've included a tiny little bit of wiggle room just in case, but we do need to try and be fairly precise. Okay, stitching along the line between part 8 and everything else. And remember, starting exactly at the beginning and stopping exactly at the end. We're not going into that seam allowance with this stitching. Truthfully, you could if you wanted to, or if you do, it's not a mistake. Okay, so that's the stitching done. Now all there is to do is fold that corner back so it covers the seam allowance and press that in place. And then, as I said, you would do the other 3 corners in numerical order, and then basically they will frame your crocus as so. Now the final stage obviously is to trim down everything to the solid edge of the pattern. So just a basic quilting ruler for that. To be fair, this one's actually probably a bit too big, but whatever you've got available should work. So here we're just basically being tidy and getting rid of everything that would get caught in our seam allowance. And as you can see, we are trimming the paper with this as well. We're not folding back this time. And there you pretty much have it, the Crocus foundation paper piecing pattern. Don't forget to head over to the website gentlemancrafter.com to download the pattern and the cutting guide and give this a go yourself. I look forward to seeing what you make.